Well, hello, my name is Aaron Johnson. I'm the CEO of Work Truck Solutions. I want to extend my welcome to you to the Spring 2023 Commercial Vehicle Summit. I want to thank you for your participation. Whether you're joining us live or you're listening remote, your participation is helping all of us and the ecosystem of commercial vehicles in general. It's very, very important that we all look at the future of what we expect to experience. And this group, whether you're participating by listening or on a panel or as a speaker, you're actually helping forge that future. And we have a panel today that's going to do a big part of that as we look at the future of vehicle acquisition. You know, these sessions are just a constant reminder of all the businesses and individuals that we get to assist in our role in the commercial vehicle overall ecosystem. In fact, I was telling the group as we were getting ready to come in, I tried to keep track of all the businesses and individual sole proprietors that were servicing me personally, even as I was just preparing today and looking outside. I had my propane tank was filled, which today can be painful, but a very, very specialized commercial vehicle. Those power lines, we had some preventative maintenance going on. And for those of us that live in Northern California, we're very sensitive to that. And so very grateful for the work they do. And so each one of us in our role in this ecosystem has the privilege of serving these individuals that we describe in many different ways, certainly essential businesses, essential individuals over the last couple of years. And so in this particular session, what we're going to look at is the future as we think about the acquisition of commercial vehicles through some online process. Now, in the retail space, we've seen this grow in different areas. We've seen the ability to acquire, select, et cetera, the vehicles through some sort of online process, in some cases completely, in some cases partially. The premise is that the commercial vehicle industry and commercial vehicles specifically, for a variety of reasons, is quite different in that regard. And so our panelists today represent different steps along the buyer journey. And so we'll explore how these differences provide both challenges and opportunities as we look at the future of vehicle acquisition. So let me first let each of these panelists introduce themselves, a little bit about them and where they fit in this buyer journey before we get started on some of the specifics. So Germana, let me ask you first to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Germana Paterlini, and I'm the co-founder of Certusoft. Certusoft is a software company that provides software for the sales side, so for OEM to help their dealers customize their vehicles. And we also provide software for their engineering at the back end and also for manufacturing. So our goal is to take the entire process from sales to manufacturing and make it easier. We have been in business about 20 years, and traditionally our tools have been used behind the dealers of the chassis builder. The past 5 years, we said, why is what we're going to do with the body? And so we realized that the matching the body to the chassis, it's kind of a lengthy process today. And so we said we want to speed up that process. Why can we just make sure that at the sales point, you can find the right chassis and the right body? And therefore, we built an application which is all web-based. It's called Build Your Truck, where people, with the way we started was with dry box vans. So if you are looking for a dry box van, you can find the right chassis for your body, or the other way around. If you already have a chassis, you can figure out what type of body will fit. And then you'll be able to customize your body and then just push a button and ask for a quote. At the back end, the engineering, they're going to take that quote, and what we are going to produce is an entire assembly which is ready to build. So it's the same idea, simplifying the process from sales to manufacturing. but now we make it available on the web for you to use. Very simple, and for the engineering as well.
That's great, Germana. Thank you so very much at the early stage of that buyer journey in terms of them exploring and identifying the particular needs of their business and bringing that to kind of the design of a particular vehicle. Tucker, let's go to you next.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tucker Erickson, and I've been in the insurance industry for over 30 years. My concentration for most of it has been specialty commercial auto and trucking insurance. And I've also specialized in startup commercial companies as well as startup trucking programs. I currently work at Risk Partners as the managing director, which is a wholesale insurance operation that is owned by Holman Enterprises. At Holman, I build programs for our internal fleet management clients, as well as programs for our retail agency force that submits business to us. Holman is the world's largest privately owned fleet management company. We've got about 2 million vehicles under our tutelage in our fleet management programs, and we own almost 40 dealerships. In addition to fleet management, we do upfitting, vehicle equipment, the sourcing of vehicles, servicing of those vehicles, the insurance, of course, and we are very avid investors in the future of mobility. When I reflect on online buying and I think about that, my thoughts really go in two different directions. There is the commoditization of commercial auto, which if you have a very low hazard, one unit pickup or van, the insurance can be very quick and simple. And then there is what I consider the higher hazard path. It's when you get involved in more complicated vehicles, heavier vehicles, tougher classes of business, more distressed operations. So when I talk today, I'll be talking perhaps in what it would be like in both of those paths, looking at low hazard type operations versus high hazard, and how the online purchase may be simple or extremely complicated.
Yeah, so you're starting to touch on some of the uniquenesses within the space, especially around not just what the VIN would indicate about the vehicle, but the actual the use case of that vehicle and the business that's actually acquiring it. That'll be great. And Jameel, let's move to you next.
My name is Jameel Ghata. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of PAVE. We're a virtual vehicle inspection company that allows anybody, anywhere to become a skilled inspector. Essentially, we have a guided photo capture process where we take the user through our mobile web application to take a series of photos, and then our inspection engine analyzes those photos and produces a line item graded condition report. Where we're used as it relates to online purchasing and online merchandising is really to enhance the trust and transparency of the listing. So really allowing for buyers and bidders to make more confident decisions about whether they want to purchase that vehicle based on its condition. We also are used for B2B or dealer-to-dealer sales, whereby the buyer can get a more up-to-date understanding of the vehicle that they may want to acquire. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely, Jameel. Look forward to kind of exploring that piece of it, especially as we think about some of the components that come into online vehicle acquisition, and including I have a vehicle that I need to do something with, perhaps on the remarketing side. And last but certainly not least, Eric.
My name is Eric Foster. I'm head of marketing and business development at Taycor. Taycor is a tech-forward commercial lender. Our approach to market is very much driven through online marketplaces, and we are very interested in continuing to unlock the potential of e-commerce for B2B transactions. My expertise is in e-commerce. I've spent most of my career in B2B e-commerce, and excited to be here.
Thanks, Eric. And I look forward to kind of thinking about some of your prior experience, even in the e-commerce space, and how lessons learned in other sectors then could be applied to some of the dynamics that are occurring in the commercial vehicle space. And then, of course, at Work Truck Solutions, we have Convoy, our national marketplace, where we provide a variety of education and certainly listing services for different organizations. And so that's kind of the area that we certainly operate as it relates to this particular topic. So, again, where we start with this discussion is the premise that the buying experience, the activities associated with acquiring a particular commercial vehicle are just different in a variety of different ways from retail, and how that might affect this notion of an online buying experience. So what I wanted to do is get kind of each of your perspectives on that. If you think about that purchasing experience, what about the commercial vehicle space from your perspective makes it unique? And that'll kind of help lay out some of the areas that we need to reflect on as we look at how we can make progress on these elements. So Germana, I'm going to go right back to you as you kind of represent the beginning of this process. How do you see kind of the uniqueness in the CV space?
Sure. We think that visualization is a very important component. So that's why we build an application where you can see the complete truck in 3D. You can inspect it. You can customize. As you customize it, you can see the changes. This is not just a toy. Maybe you have seen a 3D configurators for passenger cars, and the 3D is there mostly for aesthetic reason. You can change the car color, you can change the wheels, but for a commercial vehicle, there's much more than that. So everybody is familiar with the configurator at the sales point, but why make it so difficult? And also why traditionally when you go and purchase a vehicle, at the end you get the PDF file, so maybe 20 pages or more with all the details. You still may not know how your vehicle is going to look like. So we think the visualization is very important in this process, and to make it right, it has to be accurate. And if it is accurate, at the end of the day, it's also makes things easier for the engineers to actually start building the truck right away. So the goal here is also to speed up the process from sales to manufacturing.
Yeah, so by gathering that kind of specific requirements from the buyer early, you could shorten the time for that vehicle then to be actually available to them. Have you seen any challenges with the buyer or the organization looking for a vehicle being able to kind of express their specific business needs along the lines of the type of vehicle that they would need? Is there do they need kind of, if you observe where kind of interaction, question, answer, discussion can be helpful in this process?
Sure. So we have seen that people like to play with the application, so it's very intuitive. And they're asking more. They're asking more body type, more chassis. So the reason why we don't have more body types is because the OEMs, both the body builders and the chassis builders, for them it's a very new concept. So it's outside their traditional way of doing business. So, for example, a chassis OEM would give you a bodybuilder manual, all right, and which is thick manual. You have to understand how it works, and that's it. That's all they give you. The bodybuild manual, in our opinion, is not really necessary if you can actually, embed all that calculation, all the things into the application, into the 3D application.
Yeah.
So the demand from the user, we think, is strong. What we would like is to have the OEM and the bodybuilder on board at a faster pace, so we can offer more.
Yeah, that's great. Tucker, you had mentioned a couple things in your intro that are unique in terms of trying to assess the needs of a commercial buyer versus a retail buyer. Maybe expand on that a little bit, and how you could that creates both maybe challenge and opportunity in this notion of an online process.
Absolutely. So as I alluded to in my remarks, those lower hazard units, when you're purchasing a one-off van or a one-off pickup truck, the industry's really commoditized that insurance product during the buying process. And there's dozens of markets that would quickly quote a lower hazard consumer. And there's so much information available today to insurance companies. You can decode a VIN and have a ton of information on a vehicle. You obviously get a ton of information from an MVR. So if we're talking a low hazard vehicle, a clean MVR, a VIN that fits their model, and you top that off with a good credit score, it is really quick for a consumer to get a really competitive insurance quote for a lower hazard unit. I think the minute that your exposure becomes what I call higher hazard, then I think the model changes quite a bit and it becomes much more challenging. And that's when the consumers need more help. The industry, the insurance industry and commercial auto has lost a ton of money the last 20 years. Not so bad with those lower hazard units, but on the higher hazard stuff, it's just been, really increasing, premiums year after year, and the carriers have lost a lot of money. So it's been a challenge for carriers to figure out how to write that higher hazard business profitably. So there is a lot more hands-on, when we're talking about for hire trucking, towing, couriers, medical transport, all those, dozens of higher hazard classes, makes it challenging. And then you add a poor MVR in the mix, or a driver under 21, or a driver over 65, becomes a different ballpark as far as premiums and the amount of scrutiny that a carrier will want to look at. So a big divergence on how insurance would look at those two different types of exposures.
Yeah, and how granular do you need to get in terms of kind of identifying this kind of hazard notion around the type of business that this will be deployed in? Is that something that you capture electronically today?
Yeah, there's a lot of different tools and information available. And insurance companies are getting more and more specific on their guidelines. And there may be, you know, 15 markets out there that'll look at the higher hazard, but they're all have chosen their own very specific statement, classes of business. And within that, they've got driver guidelines and radius guidelines and the DOT numbers get involved, and then insurance carriers start looking at DOT scores and start diving into a lot of information that's available today that wasn't available 15 and 20 years
Yeah,
ago to insurance companies.
yeah, well, that's great. We'll come back to you a little later. We'll ask a little bit about the fleet side of kind of what you do as well. And let me just kind of maybe skip now to the end of the some level of the buyer journey. Eric, as you look at kind of the financing piece, when you look at your experience across these different sectors, what are you finding that's significantly different as you think about the commercial space?
What is so exciting about commercial from our perspective is that new car smell is less important than it is on the retail side of the business. Your business buyer is a more practical buyer. They're looking to mitigate risk, but ultimately they're looking for productivity. And so if you can address the friction points in an arm's length transaction like online affords and provide them with the tools to get the transaction done, you'll do more online business than in a retail environment, which really tends to be hybrid. It'll start online, but ultimately has to end in a dealership because people want to kick that tire, feel that leather seat, smell that new car smell, as it were. So as a finance company, we've learned over the last 7 years that finance, although it would seem to be at the end of the transaction, actually is at the beginning of the transaction and the end.
Yeah,
People are asking, what can I afford to buy very early in the process, as well as how am I going to pay for it? And so it's a combination of those aspects and the visualization of the product that you're looking to buy, as Germana has mentioned, the inspection of the product, especially when it comes to used versus new, that Jameel is mentioning, that all lend towards those transactions continuing to move forward, and ultimately Tucker's product of insurance and financing help to consummate that transaction.
That's great, Eric. I like this notion of financing throughout. And anything in terms of as you look at fleet size or kind of the organization that is the purchasing organization itself that varies. Do you see different types of concerns at a larger fleet size versus a smaller fleet size, for example?
Most certainly. So as the size of the transaction increases, so does the risk. And so the considerations are more nuanced when it comes to a larger fleet organization. When it's a smaller organization, there's fewer decision makers, and the need tends to be a higher sense of urgency. So really, it's about streamlining the transaction for the smaller fleets and providing enough information to eliminate those friction points for the larger fleets.
Okay, good. Jameel, you were mentioned in that response. You obviously have lots of experience on kind of assessments and those sorts of things. So maybe speak a little bit to how your engagement with the commercial buyer or seller, and depending on the side of the transaction you're looking at, differs from retail.
Yeah, happy to, Aaron. I mean, I think in general, digital wholesaling, online dealer-to-dealer trade networks and B2B vehicle sales online has been picking up traction, out of necessity, of course, for the last few years, but honestly, also due to advances in the asset owner's willingness to transact online and tools like the panels discussing today that allow the buyer to confidently understand the condition of the vehicle and then ultimately all parts of that transaction online. As it relates specifically to variability with commercial vehicles versus passenger vehicles, with commercial, there's a large variety of vehicles. What that vehicle potentially turned into could be unknown over the course of its useful life. So having tools, like PAVE, for instance, where we can use visual indicators to understand upfits, customizations, configurations to better, produce a more accurate listing for online purchasing becomes important. And then I think when you think about overall buyer behavior, so if there's a need to purchase vehicles in bulk versus one-offs, just having the online platform support that and then support all of the services required to purchase that vehicle and get it to them efficiently and effectively differs a little bit as it relates to traditional passenger car online marketplaces.
Things that's come up a lot in the various sessions, especially in the ones that we had today, as the commercial vehicle space continues to change, technology continues to change, is this idea of ensuring that we have transparency to our buyers along the types of products that they're interested in pursuing. And in some cases, we're all learning as well. So I'm curious, when you think about the very beginning, again, of the process, as it relates to education, the notion of trying to ensure that the buyer's aware of kind of all their options, aware of the technologies, aware of how each of kind of your areas are changing as well. How much of your kind of time is spent on the education side, or trying to again bring buyers along this kind of notion of transparency through the cycle? And Tucker, I'll start with you. You had obviously mentioned some things on the insurance side, but I know you have kind of visibility into some of the fleet purchasing as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I came across last week. We were working with a fleet client who was a large contractor, and the consumers quite often don't understand the impact of just some of the little things that they do in the process. And for instance, this contractor was working with us on getting some insurance quotes, and it was not a very complicated insurance fleet, but he had a picture on his website of his team standing next to the George Washington Bridge. Well, one of my markets, avoids the five boroughs of New York. So he doesn't even do business in the five boroughs, but he wanted to give himself the impression that he was much bigger, more powerful company than what he was. And, so it was interesting. Now he had that picture down within 24 hours and was trying to change perceptions pretty quickly. But, that was very interesting. Another client I was working with, a fleet client of Holman's that never had a DOT number before, but was starting to get some heavier vehicles and had gotten one. Some of the information that you initially provide, and I believe annually you update it when you're dealing with the Federal Motor Cargo Safety Administration, is that you give them some initial numbers of your fleet size and who you are. And this client doubled the number of units that he actually has. And again, and this was a different carrier, had questioned, well, here's your application with this list of vehicles and the DOT submission that they made to the FMCSA has double the amount of vehicles. So, and again, it was just a matter of the client trying to impress and be bigger than what he is. And there was really no need for it, just silly. So of course I had to have him sign a statement, agreeing to what he had. But there's a lot of things that I find with fleet management clients that, they always are finding out after the fact, after they're disappointed with an insurance company. One that happens a lot is that you'll get a quick quote from either a company directly or from an agent, and that quote is, depending on the state, can be subject to further review 30, 60, or 90 days after you bind the business. And I've had insureds really get upset by MVR surcharges that they're getting after the fact. A national company might bind it quickly to get the business on the books, but then they're digging into the MVRs and adding on surcharges. Other situations come up where, clients don't disclose the special contracts they have with their best clients that require certificates of insurance with, very technical wording, very specialized waivers of subrogation or additional insureds that are wording maybe outside of the industry norm. So they go with a carrier that is a black and white carrier that doesn't really look outside of their box. And then they find out within a short period of time that they can't fulfill their needs. So they end up having to move shortly after putting their insurance in place. So with fleet management clients, the good thing is that a lot of time you can talk to them in advance of their insurance purchase, get them prepared for what's coming up, and talk through these things so that you understand the process and what things could come back to bite them if they don't handle it up front.
And that's a good example of, when you think about this kind of end-to-end acquisition process, doing this online through, warranty service programs, fleet management, insurance, et cetera, to try to, there's a lot of kind of these special case items that need to be addressed and that where buyers need to be educated. Germana, I'm curious, as you've now had lots of organizations work through the process of designing, building, any kind of education components that need to come up? Is there, just if they're not quite sure how this would particularly work with their particular use case, those sorts of things?
So traditionally, we have been building configurators for the OEM. So it's used by the dealers. So they go online and they start the configuration. It can be very, complex depending on the type of vehicle. So usually typically the OEM would do some training for their dealers. And then they will be using, those our tools over the years, so they get familiar with it, and we are the second line of support and so forth. By going directly online with a 3D and using visualization, we think so that it will be easier. There is less of a need for training the dealer. So even the end user, um, one of the challenges is also finding people, to train,
Yeah.
and to be so this would be a way for bringing people on board, the new generation on board, that they are more familiar with I guess the internet and video games and so forth. So so we try to make it fun. So definitely, there will be a need for explaining why they cannot do some of the things. Why they cannot pick a certain body lengths, or so there should be kind of an explanation. But we try to make it as self-explanatory as possible. And also to make it much easier even for the dealers if they need some training. Yeah.
Right. So if the dealer wants to go through that same configuration process, or if it's an end buyer, your approach really
Yeah.
is to educate along the way,
Yes.
answer those questions as they come up based on the design they're trying to create.
Yeah. So we spend a lot of time in improving the UI and the user experience, and with continuous feedback. Sometimes it's a question about educating them. Sometimes it's more like setting up the user interface in such a way that they follow a certain sequence so they make
Yeah.
sense and they can get to the end point faster and better. So
Yeah.
it's a little bit back and forth. Yeah.
Eric, how much time do your team spend as they're interacting on these topics in terms of educating on options, or what they have available to them, don't have available to them, those sorts of things? Is that a place where you and your team spend time?
It absolutely is. Customer journey is, I think, paramount to our focus. We spend as much time listening to what customers feel like they need in order to be able to move a transaction forward as we do educating and informing them about what options are available. But we really view technology as an empowerment tool for our teams. So it is both our ability to offer easy solutions online, as it is to make sure that we're available to answer those questions as they come up, and use that information or that moment as a learning opportunity for us to enhance our service, so that maybe next time that question won't come up again.
Yeah. And do you find that, again, just back to kind of the size of the purchaser, that those questions are different, or do you find that they're common?
There's most certainly commonalities, but the larger transactions require a more sophisticated approach, both in terms of the financial vehicles that are used, as well as the type of information we need as a lender in order to be able to move that deal to its ultimate funding status. So, quite literally, everyone on this panel would at some stage be facilitating the transaction for us, because we need the inspection if we're ultimately going to lend the money. We need the insurance if we're ultimately going to lend the money on that asset. And we wanted to make sure that the customer is buying truly the vehicle that fits their purpose. So the visualization is critical to ensuring that what is being purchased is ultimately going to be used.
Yeah, that's great. And Jameel, kind of coming back to you on the inspection portion, when an individual is looking at their retail vehicle, or their vehicle they use for personal use, the idea of what matters is a little bit maybe more straightforward than you talk about on a commercial vehicle. So, how much education time do you need to spend in terms of making sure the crane works, and the snowplow goes up and down, and those sorts of things? I'm curious how that works in the commercial vehicle space from your perspective.
Yeah, happy to answer that, Aaron. I think it really all starts with trust and transparency, to Eric's point, across the selling and buying journey. So, we focus on the trust and transparency of the vehicle information. So it's an accurate description of the vehicle, it's an accurate condition assessment of the vehicle. And so as buyers and sellers as well get more comfortable listing vehicles online, they can get more comfortable with understanding that the information that relates to that commercial vehicle is accurate and the condition assessment is also accurate. So I think it's just through the repetitive nature of using and trusting the online marketplace that they'll become more comfortable with it. I mean, as you mentioned, I think it's important that the marketplace in general provides a variety of vehicle inventory types, right? Because one of the key things about purchasing online is that we want it to be a more efficient process, right? A more efficient, more cost-effective process. So to the extent that all of those types of inventory are there for the marketplace participants to transact, and they're accurate in terms of the listing, that's really some of the winning formula to move online purchasing in the commercial space forward. The final thing I'll say is I think, you know, as I think Eric mentioned as well, you know, just starting to build out all of the ancillary services required to get from A to Z as it relates to the transaction. So transportation, delivery, that's really specialized to commercial vehicles. You know, that's going to become even more important, you know, as it relates to fostering more transactions online.
Yeah, and certainly I appreciate kind of all that detail. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, the notion of providing as much information as possible at the listing level is critical, and you know, really part of, you know, what we try to do on Convoy, as well as kind of the educational piece. You know, you mentioned this idea that there are, you know, gaps, if you will, today in, you know, from beginning to end on the online journey for commercial vehicles. What are, you mentioned a couple, you mentioned transportation. What are some other gaps that you see that exist today that we need to address?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, as you can imagine, the transparency of the vehicle information and the trustworthiness of it and the condition is obviously what we're focused on. So I might just use that as the basis for my response. But, you know, we really aim to try to make the marketplace as efficient as possible within our part of the puzzle. So, you know, not requiring a skilled inspector to have to come out, not having to wait, not having to hold that inventory for more time than you need to, by simply, you know, taking photos and having a independent inspection that essentially anybody can use. That's really what we focus on and what we're trying to plug the gap right now. I think the more information, the more vehicle information, the more condition information that we can get on these online commercial vehicle listings, the more that the buyers and the sellers will trust it as a acquisition and disposal method.
Yeah. Germana, as you look at the process beyond kind of the manufacturing piece that where you spend the bulk of your time, where do you see kind of the gaps to get the deal all the way through, you know, the acquisition of that vehicle all the way through from an automated standpoint?
The major gap is the lack of strong communication between the chassis builder and the body builder. Because you know, the dealer, usually you go to a dealer to buy the chassis, and then they have sometimes they call up on the phone someone they know that would build the body for them, and that transaction may go back and forth many times. The chassis may change, the body may change, and that transaction back and forth, you know, the change order process takes time the way it's done today, because it's not automated. So the ability of communicating, you know, bringing in, pulling in the information from the body into the chassis and vice versa, doesn't mean that you have to exchange all the information, but the necessary information in such a way that when the chassis comes to the bodybuilder, is the right chassis, so they don't have to spend time, you know, cutting the rails, for example, or doing other modification. It's ready to go. You know, that's a great benefit. It's a great benefit for the end buyer, and it's a great benefit for the manufacturer. So that's what we stress all the time, that, you know, when we talk with both parties, trying to make them understand that this is advantageous for both of them.
Yeah, yeah. And Tucker, for Holman, from your perspective, which is broad kind of across this process. Where do you see kind of some of the big gaps that we haven't already kind of exposed in terms of vehicle acquisition online?
Yeah, well, it's certainly challenging to negotiate with a computer. So, I'll give the example. Last month, I wrote a large sand and gravel account in our risk retention group that Holman runs, and we went through the whole process of the pricing negotiation, and I added a liability deductible to get the consumer's price down per unit, and looking at different terms, and we're just about ready to seal the deal. And there are 6 drivers that my reinsurance company that backs the program doesn't want to insure. So it was a lot of back and forth. And at the end of the day, the insured had to let go 3 drivers, and we put 3 drivers on probation. But, that kind of back and forth and negotiation, can be really challenging on these higher hazard accounts. And, and I even see it a lot on these small fleets. So, you have someone goes online, buys a pickup truck, buys a second one. It's can be pretty straightforward if the MVRs are good. And like I said, the credit score is fine. They're going a local distance. Maybe they're a landscaper, low hazard class of business. But now all of a sudden, this landscape company is growing large enough that they want an extra heavy dump truck for some bigger projects. Now they need a driver with a CDL license. They don't know that, understand that. Now they need, they're on the border of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, so they cross state lines. So they need a DOT number, and they've got to do filings with FMCSA. So now all of a sudden they need some expertise. They need an insurance agent or a fleet manager that's sophisticated enough to help them through these processes. And I think, it's going to be very challenging in the near future for, a lot of this higher hazard exposures to be commoditized to the point that the one pickup or van can be done quickly and very, very easily. Certainly, you see the younger generations trying to do everything online. It took me until COVID to actually understand how amazing Amazon was and that everything could be delivered to my door. But so now I have to force myself to go support the local businesses. Um, it's just I think they're gonna really push the envelope and try to commoditize as much as they can. But with all these unique challenges with this higher hazard business, there's experts are always gonna have to be involved somehow, and we're gonna have to look for ways to, meet that right balance.
Well, as a member of the package a day on the porch club, I can appreciate your gravitating towards the online piece. So Eric, as you mentioned, you really are involved from the beginning to the end on this process. You also have a background in e-commerce in a variety of different areas. What are the big gaps today from your perspective? And maybe it's not so much that under every circumstance they exist, but maybe there's circumstances that are fairly kind of streamlined at this point, and maybe some circumstances that are a little bit more complicated. So curious of your view kind of from a gap perspective is where we sit today.
Yeah. So I think the best way to describe it is to support these transactions, it takes a village. It takes a number of different organizations offering unique specialities, such as this panel, in order to truly eliminate the friction points from that online transaction. I think there are significant benefits, though, to those organizations who do embrace helping to remove those friction points. Because what I've seen over the last 7 years working across a large number of online marketplaces is that the buyer wants this type of transaction. It's more convenient than having to go sit in a dealership and drink 20 cups of coffee while you're waiting to have the deal done. It's actually more cost effective to find equipment across the country than it is to try to limit yourself to only being able to buy within your small sphere. And again, the B2B buyer, they don't care about the new car smell. They care about practicality, and it's much easier to upload a document while you're still in your office than it is to be in the dealership and realize you didn't bring the document that you needed. So I think it's inevitable that e-commerce is going to dominate the B2B large equipment purchase. And it's really dependent on us as providers to embrace that ourselves and eliminate the friction points we're creating because we're used to that legacy business model.
And I think you heard some of that in some of our panel discussions earlier, especially from our participants that are dealers, and making sure, because there's this relationship that of service that needs to continue to exist beyond the transaction. And so focusing on the value add, whether it be things like fleet management, telematics, so all the different pieces and parts that make that vehicle more and more valuable for the individual business that needs it, whether it be a large fleet or a sole proprietorship. And so I think that from a, would be wonderful we had a dealer perspective on this, because I think from in that circumstance, it's important that the relationship that gets established has this kind of long-term notion, so that they get the very most out of that asset that they're purchasing. And that's the one thing that we always have to remember when they go to acquire. Business goes to acquire a vehicle like we're describing. They're acquiring a tool in order for them to achieve their mission and purpose. And it's a tool like lots of other tools that they have, very specific, very specialized, and it needs to have kind of that care and feeding along the way, beyond even just the purchase. So I think that's something that in this process we also need to keep in mind. Maybe the other thing that I want to talk a little bit about that tends to be unique in the commercial vehicle space, and I think affects most of us, is this notion of valuation. So when we think about the used portion, whether it be a trade-in situation or the acquisition of a used piece of inventory, because of the uniqueness of these vehicles and therefore some of the small cohorts that can exist in terms of like vehicles, those sorts of things. Jameel, how does your kind of organization think about this notion of valuation on a commercial piece of inventory?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's more complicated, of course, than the passenger market. There's no real uniform standard, and I think that it all comes back to vehicle information, I think, when it relates to this. I mean, of course, there are many other factors that you want to take into account, but they're a bit more straightforward as it relates to your local market, what you should be paying, and other factors. But if you focus on the actual VIN and that vehicle, there's a lot of question marks as to what's happened over the course of that vehicle's life cycle in commercial as it relates to upfits, other aspects that perhaps aren't as prevalent. You might see it in the passenger car market more around value-added options or other aftermarket accessories, but not as much as occurs in the commercial market, because it's for this core use that perhaps the vehicle has evolved since it was originally sort of manufactured. So that's where we feel like having a photo-based analytics solution can supplement gaps in the vehicle information that's provided. So as long as you have visual evidence and tools that can analyze that and understand parts of the vehicles and what that pertains to, then at least you have confidence in that condition adjusted factor as you make your valuation decision overall.
And how about you, Eric? When you obviously are in the business of understanding what a vehicle is worth, how does that affect you differently from a commercial perspective?
It's really one of our biggest pain points, especially with supply chain disruptions when it comes to used assets. The valuations of those used assets have skyrocketed over the last several years. But I think Jameel hit the nail on the head. It's about good data. If you have good data, we can make better decisions on how much money to lend against a particular vehicle. And without that data, we're really exposed to risk as the lender over lending on a particular asset that may not have that fair market value if push comes to shove and we need to in some way liquidate that asset.
I'm gonna one more question, then you can prepare for the last question I'll ask you is, are we going to get there and when? So you can be thinking about your response there. But before we get to that, a lot of the discussion in the sessions last couple of days have been around, and I'll steal Catherine Schifferle's wording here, alternate propulsion. in terms of vehicles, and how does that this notion of whether it be electrification or other alternatives, how does that either simplify or complicate kind of this move towards e-commerce for EVs? And Tucker, I'll start with you.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't make it easier. The technology, the cost of repairs, the insurance companies' rates keeping up. It's all very challenging. Insurance companies haven't done a good job keeping up with valuations. An example I can give you is recently I had a conversation with an actuarial firm, and I was asking about our physical damage rates for our program that we have for physical damage for our fleet clients. And they were telling me, well, the pricing actually, the rates that were needed for losses went down the last couple of years because of COVID, but no insurance carrier really saw it surging back as quickly as it did. And they were, I think, caught off guard, and they may have reduced their rates based on a couple of years experience and were caught looking very foolish. And I think the same thing is with the electronic vehicles and new vehicles hitting the market and the cost of repairs. And, we were all caught off guard. You were talking about, the values of vehicles and looking at how many people actually bought out their leased vehicles, because all of a sudden they became a family asset or a business asset when they weren't before. And gap insurance, all of a sudden has become a real issue. And I'm constantly now negotiating claims with physical damage claims where the argument over values is much more prevalent today than it was a few years ago between the consumer and the insurance company and myself and the agent playing middleman. And I see more of that with electrification. We're just scratching the surface. I think with what's going to happen and the uptick in the volume for electrification is just going to continue to ramp up. And again, unfortunately, the insurance industry will be behind the 8 ball and not, keep up with understanding the impact of what perhaps those values are going to be, and the effectiveness and the ability to have even the distribution network of repair facilities that can handle repairing them timely and the downtime, and making sure that all those parts that are much more expensive than they were are going to be available. So it's a domino effect probably on all aspects of the industry, from the vehicle values and the electrification, and that's only going to continue.
Germana, how do the alternate fuels start to affect this kind of manufacturing process, the configuration piece that you're working on?
For us, there are more opportunities, because there are more opportunities for us to use the software for configuring an electric trucks. So there are different type of challenges, and also different type of challenges than with an ICE vehicle for the body. So the software is agnostic to the type of propulsion. So, but the more diversity and the more value for our services there is. One thing, so going back to the evaluation, we don't, we are the 0 point, when you buy the vehicle. And so what we provide is so-called a digital twin. So it's just like a fingerprint of what you're buying. So you have a knowledge of all the components and where they were made and so forth. So that kind of forms the ground zero, and that could be useful, as the vehicle ages and goes through transformation. So as far as electrification, it's a good opportunity for us. We also provide a software that estimates the range of an electric vehicle depending on the route and depending on temperature and other variable. So that is not in front of the user yet. We provide it to an OEM, but so as far as the, we are very happy with the new opportunities.
Yeah, and that range kind of component is a big part of any e-commerce experience for an electric vehicle. That under what circumstances should the expectations exist? Much more granular, especially if you're dealing with box trucks and you're thinking about weight and those sorts of things. So how does that scale? Jameel, on the valuation side or on the evaluation side of kind of looking at photos and things, it seems like you need a little bit more data than you maybe do on internal combustion engines.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm not sure if you've seen the vans that Rivian's made for Amazon, but they inset the tire a little bit, so it's much harder to tell the tire tread depth. I'm not sure if they were thinking about that as they manufactured that vehicle, but it does become important with electric vehicles because they are heavier and the tires wear faster. But I think it does come down to a couple things, battery health being the main one, and trusting that that you have a good sense of the impact of that on the overall condition and valuation of the vehicle. I think you'll start to see specialty marketplaces come up that look to service EVs as a unique asset class that really starts to get that aspect of it right. But it's really important, especially as it relates to the value, the impact to the battery and its useful life over the course of the vehicle.
Well, Eric, where do you see us heading now? Where do you see us heading in terms of this notion of CV vehicles online acquisition?
I really feel the future is bright. We've seen a dramatic increase in demand to complete purchases online over the last 7 years. And it's really the online marketplaces that are embracing that completion of the transaction that are winning in this situation. It's those that continue to only list equipment and not really try to participate in the transaction that I think will be the losers in the long run. I'm decoupling that answer a little bit from the alternate propulsion vehicle because I do feel that that will be slower. And I think for very practical reasons, I think ultimately businesses buy what businesses need in order to get the job done. It's a very different mindset and a very different order of priorities than your retail consumer would make. And as we see more businesses embracing these alternate propulsion vehicles, we'll have to come to grips as a lender with how we will lend against that asset versus a more traditional type vehicle. I believe it will evolve where the larger fleets will probably see the most success in terms of getting a true finance or lease vehicle for those purchases. And the smaller fleets, it may take a little longer before ultimately lenders are ready to do those kind of transactions.
So we'll have segments kind of moving forward at different paces. Tucker, anything you see different in that regard?
No, I agree. It's going to be different segments will move faster than others on the insurance front as well. 15 years ago, everyone predicted that telematics was going to be the driver of insurance costs and premiums. And, we've seen it tick up, but it's never been, I think it's, maybe 10% of a driving force now in commercial vehicles where telematics is being used in a real way to, rate and charge insurance costs. So I think, there'll definitely continue to be a strong uptick in those low hazard units like we discussed. But I think we're a long way off for those higher hazard exposures to be able to be completed online without some human interaction.
So we have opportunity for moving forward just in certain segments.
Right.
Jameel, do you see it similarly or different?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some level of precedence for the shift towards online purchasing when you look at the wholesale passenger car B2B marketplace, moving primarily now to digital. So I think will it become the norm eventually? I believe it will. I think it'll just be a stepwise path to get there, and supporting services like everybody on this panel today will be critical to the adoption.
Germana, any following thoughts or last thoughts?
Well, if for regarding AV or different fuels, for way of propulsion, we are ready. If the technology is there, the technology, the software technology is there for both the OEM and the bodybuilder. So anytime they want to get on board, it's a possibility. So the sky is the limit, and so it's time to move forward.
Thank you. And so let me just thank all of you, Tucker, Eric, Germana, Jameel. I really appreciate your time today. It's always good to get kind of varying perspectives along this buyer journey. And so I'm very, very grateful. And again, for those of you that have been listening in or are looking at this recording, again, just want to express my gratitude to this panel. Please stick around. Our next session is on the future of automotive commercial. Steve Greenfield and Catherine Trifley, you don't want to miss that one.